They buried the ledgers 3 times, first in 1857, when the state authorities began asking questions about the unusually high number of mixed-race children being sold from Willow Creek Plantation. Again in 1865, when the Union soldiers marched through St. Landry Parish. And finally in 1921, when the last surviving daughter of Jeremiah Blackwood sealed the remaining documents in a copper box and buried it beneath the family chapel before burning the building to the ground. For over a century, the dark truth of Louisiana's most profitable slave plantation remained hidden beneath layers of soil and silence. Until now. The first photograph of Jeremiah Blackwood shows a man of imposing stature. Standing on the front steps of the plantation house in 1838, his face bears the confident expression of a man accustomed to absolute authority. The surrounding parish records describe him as a gentleman of considerable means who arrived from Virginia with a small fortune and quickly established himself among Louisiana's planter elite. What those same records fail to mention is the true source of the Blackwood fortune, a breeding operation that would eventually produce over 300 enslaved individuals, many of whom carried Blackwood's own blood. You might wonder how such horror could exist without record. The answer lies in the careful construction of historical memory. Parish baptismal records note only that Blackwood was blessed with numerous godchildren among the plantation enslaved. Census documents record an unusual number of light-skinned house servants. Medical journals from the plantation physician reference treatments for the special bloodline and the master's interests. But the complete picture remained deliberately obscured, protected by wealth, power, and the complicity of an entire community willing to avert its gaze from the unspeakable. In 1834, Jeremiah Blackwood's wife Elizabeth died in childbirth, leaving him with 3 daughters, Catherine, Mary, and Rebecca. Parish records indicate he never remarried. Neighboring plantation owners' diaries mention his peculiar insistence on educating his daughters in plantation management rather than sending them to finishing school in New Orleans. The Blackwood girls know more about ledgers and crop yields than they do about needlepoint, wrote one disapproving contemporary. It is most unseemly to see young women of good breeding discussing slave purchases with their father. What this observer failed to understand was that Blackwood was preparing his daughters for a specific purpose, one that would make Willow Creek the most profitable plantation in Louisiana. The plantation ledgers recovered from the chapel grounds tell a story the history books have erased. Meticulously categorized breeding records, detailing lineages, physical attributes, and projected values. Clinical notations about fertility cycles and pregnancy outcomes. And most disturbing of all, Blackwood's own system of categorizing what he called bloodline purity, tracking which children were born of his own bloodline and which were not. These documents reveal that by 1845, Jeremiah Blackwood had implemented a carefully controlled breeding program involving his 3 daughters, himself, and selected enslaved men on the plantation. The human mind seeks order in chaos, explanation in horror. Perhaps that's why local folklore transformed Jeremiah Blackwood into a possessed man, a victim of demonic influence or voodoo curse. The truth, however, is far more terrifying. The recovered documents reveal a man of cold, rational calculation, a man who viewed human beings, including his own children, as commodities to be utilized for maximum profit. The blending of superior bloodlines, he wrote in an 1844 letter to a Virginia planter, produces stock of exceptional quality. The market recognizes this quality, though buyers need not know its precise origin. The youngest daughter, Rebecca Blackwood, kept a secret diary from 1843 until her death in 1921. Found buried alongside the ledgers, its pages reveal the psychological torment behind the plantation's facade of prosperity. "Father says what we do is necessary," she wrote at 16, "that it is merely animal husbandry applied to our greatest asset, that the Bible itself shows us that bloodlines may mingle for the greater purpose. I try to believe him, yet I cannot look at their faces, these children who are both beneath me and of me, without feeling the weight of judgment." Rebecca's diary documents the gradual psychological unraveling of all 3 sisters. even as they continued to participate in their father's systematic program. You would think that such atrocity would leave visible scars on the landscape, that the soil itself would refuse to yield crops watered with such suffering. Yet visitors to St. Landry Parish today find only verdant fields and the picturesque ruins of antebellum architecture. The Willow Creek Plantation house, destroyed by fire in 1889, exists now only in a handful of daguerreotypes. The family cemetery contains 7 marked graves, none belonging to the hundreds of enslaved people whose labor and bodies built the Blackwood fortune. Parish records list Jeremiah Blackwood as a, quote, planter, businessman, and philanthropist who donated generously to the local church. In the early days of Willow Creek, before the breeding program began in earnest, Blackwood operated a typical plantation focused primarily on cotton production. Records from the 1830s show purchases of enslaved people from markets in New Orleans, with standard notations about physical condition and work capacity. But a letter dated August 1837, discovered among the buried documents, reveals the moment Blackwood's thinking began to shift. Addressed to a business associate in Charleston, it reads, "I have been considering the economics of our peculiar institution and find the greatest profit lies not in what our people produce with their hands, but what they might produce with their bodies. The natural increase of our labor force represents capital that generates itself." The transformation of Willow Creek from conventional plantation to breeding operation did not happen overnight. Recovered account books show Blackwood's experimental phase beginning around 1838, when he began separating financial entries for what he called human capital development from regular agricultural operations. Initially, neighboring planters assumed Blackwood was merely investing more heavily in the domestic slave trade, purchasing enslaved people at lower prices from markets in Virginia and Maryland, then reselling them at a profit in the deeper South after a period of seasoning. Such speculation was common enough among Louisiana planters with available capital. What they couldn't have known was that Blackwood was developing a more comprehensive and disturbing vision. A visitor to Willow Creek in 1840, a cotton broker from Mobile named Harrison Jenkins, left a telling account in his travel journal. Blackwood Plantation presents a curious aspect to the visitor. While other operations in the parish focus solely on maximizing cotton yield, Blackwood seems equally concerned with the condition of his enslaved population, particularly the women and children. He has constructed unusually substantial quarters for select house servants and maintains a separate infirmary for maternal cases. When questioned about these expenditures, Blackwood speaks of long-term investment strategies and compound returns. I find his economic theories eccentric, but cannot dispute his results. His plantation shows remarkable profitability despite producing less cotton than estates of comparable size. This cold calculus intensified following the death of Elizabeth Blackwood. Without a wife to manage the household and raise his daughters, Jeremiah turned to his most intelligent enslaved women to help run the domestic affairs of the plantation. Among these was a woman named Lucinda, described in his ledgers as, quote, 30 years of age, superior intelligence, excellent management capabilities. Plantation records indicate that Lucinda was placed in charge of the Blackwood daughters, education and household matters. What these sanitized records don't reveal is what Rebecca's diary later confirms, that Lucinda was also Jeremiah's concubine and possibly the mother of at least 2 children by him. The children produced through Blackwood's program faced fates as methodically planned as their conception. The ledgers indicate 3 categories: house stock, sale stock, and breed stock. Those designated for household service were trained from early childhood in domestic skills, but kept ignorant of their true parentage. Those marked for sale were transacted through trusted brokers in New Orleans, with careful instructions that they be sold out of state to prevent any chance of recognition or return. Most disturbing were those female children designated as breed stock, kept on the plantation, and eventually forced into the same reproductive cycle that had produced them. Dr. Thomas Mercer, the plantation physician, left medical records that provide clinical documentation of the program's physical toll. "The female subjects exhibit higher than normal rates of reproductive complications," he wrote in 1851. "This appears most pronounced in the secondary generation, suggesting some biological resistance to the crossing of related bloodlines." Mercer, whose own moral failing is evident in his continued participation, nevertheless documented the suffering with dispassionate precision. His records show that many of the women did not survive beyond their third or fourth pregnancy, their bodies depleted by repeated childbearing under plantation conditions. Mercer's complicity in the Blackwood operation represents a disturbing chapter in medical ethics. His personal correspondence, found among the buried documents, reveals his initial hesitation. In an 1846 letter to a former medical school colleague, he wrote, "I find myself in a professionally unusual situation. The management of this plantation requires medical oversight of practices I would not have encountered in urban practice. I tell myself that my presence at least ensures some standard of care for the unfortunate women involved, yet I cannot escape the awareness that my participation enables the entire enterprise." Despite these qualms, Mercer remained at Willow Creek for over 15 years, his salary approximately triple what a typical plantation physician might earn. The medical journals kept by Mercer contain detailed observations on what he clinically termed reproductive efficiency. These records show that he eventually embraced a research mindset, viewing the plantation as a laboratory for investigating human reproduction under controlled conditions. His notes document experiments with diet, work schedules, and recovery periods designed to maximize fertility and successful births. One particularly disturbing entry from 1849 reads, "Subject 23, provided with enhanced nutrition and exempted from field labor, has produced healthy twins, her second set in 3 years. This success suggests that the additional expense of specialized maintenance for selected breeding subjects is economically justified by increased production." The language throughout his records systematically dehumanizes the women under his care, reflecting the broader ideology that classified enslaved people as property rather than persons. By 1847, the Blackwood breeding operation had become sophisticated enough to require dedicated facilities. Estate improvement records show the construction of what was euphemistically called the Nursery quarters, a separate compound located half a mile from the main plantation house and regular slave quarters. Architectural drawings found among the buried documents reveal a complex designed for maximum control and surveillance. Small cabins arranged in a circle around a central courtyard, with an overseer's house positioned to observe all entrances and exits. The compound included a medical examination room where Mercer conducted regular assessments of the women's health and fertility. The architectural plans for the nursery quarters were drafted by James Thornton, a New Orleans architect whose signature appears on several prominent buildings throughout Louisiana. This connection suggests Blackwood's operations were not as secretive among certain professional circles as one might expect. Thornton's design notes, preserved with the plans, contain detailed specifications for features with no innocent explanation: soundproofed walls between units to prevent communication between occupants, windows positioned to allow observation from the overseer's station, and locking mechanisms operable only from the outside. The clinical calculation evident in these designs reveals how the brutality of the plantation system was expressed not just in individual acts of violence, but in deliberately constructed environments designed for control. Parish building permits from 1846 describe the structure merely as additional servant housing and medical facility, with no indication of its true purpose. Construction materials were sourced from multiple suppliers throughout the region, possibly to avoid drawing attention to the scale of the project. Workers brought in for the construction were transient laborers from New Orleans, rather than locals who might spread word of the unusual design. These precautions suggest that while the broader community may have suspected unusual activities at Willow Creek, Blackwood maintained a facade of conventional plantation operations through careful management of public-facing aspects of his business. What makes the Blackwood case unique is not the sexual exploitation itself. Such abuse was horrifically common throughout the slaveholding South, but rather the clinical, systematic approach and the deliberate involvement of the daughters. Neighboring plantations certainly contained children fathered by their owners, but Blackwood's operation was different in its calculated methodology, meticulous record-keeping, and intergenerational scope. It represented slavery's horrific logic taken to its most extreme conclusion, the complete commodification of human life and relationship. The discovery of the Blackwood documents has forced a reckoning with aspects of plantation slavery that historical narratives have often sanitized or omitted. The deliberate breeding of enslaved people was not merely an occasional practice, but in some cases, an institutionalized system central to plantation profitability. The Blackwood records provide irrefutable evidence of what scholars have long argued, that the reproductive capacity of enslaved women was as economically significant to the system as their labor capacity, perhaps even more so following the 1808 ban on the international slave trade. Catherine Blackwood, the eldest daughter, maintained a correspondence with several prominent Louisiana physicians, seeking advice on maximizing fertility and ensuring healthy births. These letters, preserved among the buried documents, reveal her gradual transformation from reluctant participant to coldly efficient manager. We have found that improved nutrition in the third month of pregnancy significantly reduces losses, she wrote in 1848. The additional expense is justified by the increased survival rate. The documents show that Catherine eventually took full control of the breeding program after her father's health began declining in the 1850s. The plantation's account books from the 1840s reveal how central reproductive exploitation had become to its economic model. While neighboring plantations derived their income primarily from cotton, the Blackwood ledgers show that by 1845, nearly 60% of their revenue came from the sale of enslaved people. The detailed financial calculations include projections of natural increase and return on investment for each enslaved woman of childbearing age. One disturbing notation in Mary Blackwood's elegant handwriting reads, "Lucinda's daughter Sarah delivered of healthy male child. Estimated value $500 at current rates. Projected value $1, $200 at age 18 if properly developed." Human beings reduced to entries in a ledger, their very existence valued only in terms of the profit they might generate. The middle daughter, Mary, appears to have managed the financial aspects of the operation. Her meticulous accounting books track the return on investment for each birth, calculating the costs of maintenance against projected sale values. Female children showing promise for future breeding to be valued at 150% standard rate, reads one notation from 1849. Mary's ledgers reveal that the Blackwood plantation's profit margins were nearly triple those of comparable cotton operations in the region, with almost 60% of their income derived from the sale of enslaved people rather than agricultural products. As the breeding program expanded, Jeremiah Blackwood began selecting enslaved men for specific physical and intellectual characteristics. His ledgers contain detailed assessments. Moses, 6 feet 2 inches, excellent physical specimen, intelligent, strong baritone-speaking voice, suitable for pairing with Lucinda's line. Another entry reads, Daniel demonstrates exceptional mathematical ability, calm temperament, no record of resistance, approved for limited breeding program. These clinical descriptions reveal the eugenic aspects of Blackwood's thinking, his belief that he could selectively breed for desired traits while maintaining rigorous control over the resulting human beings. The social isolation of the Blackwood women intensified as the breeding program expanded. Parish social records show a marked decline in their attendance at local gatherings after 1845. Invitations to balls and dinner parties were increasingly declined. A letter from a concerned neighbor to Catherine Blackwood, dated March 1848, reads, "We miss your presence in our social circle and worry that you and your sisters are becoming too isolated in your grief. It has been 14 years since your dear mother's passing. Surely it is time to rejoin society." The response, preserved in Catherine's papers, offers a glimpse of the elaborate deception maintained by the family. "We appreciate your concern, but our duties at Willow Creek consume our days. Father's health requires our constant attention, and we find contentment in our work." Descendants of those sold from Willow Creek Plantation can be traced today across Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and as far north as Tennessee. The DNA testing project initiated by historian Dr. Eliza Morgan in 2018 has identified over 400 living Americans whose genetic profiles indicate descent from the Blackwood lineage. What we're seeing is the biological legacy of an atrocity, Dr. Morgan explained. These genetic markers tell a story that was deliberately erased from written records. They prove that the bodies of enslaved women were not just sites of labor exploitation but also of reproductive exploitation, with effects that continue into the present day. The community surrounding Willow Creek Plantation was not ignorant of what transpired there. Local church records contain veiled references to concerning practices and moral irregularities at the Blackwood estate. Yet economic dependence and racial ideology created a conspiracy of silence. The plantation employed dozens of free white workers and conducted business with merchants throughout the parish. Tax records show that by the 1850s, the Blackwood operations accounted for nearly 30% of the parish's total revenue. Financial complicity ensured communal silence. Among the most disturbing documents recovered from the Blackwood collection are the religious justifications Jeremiah developed for his program. A personal journal from 1846 contains page after page of biblical references and theological arguments attempting to legitimize his actions. As Abraham took Hagar and produced Ishmael, so might a Christian man ensure the increase of his household, he wrote. The patriarchs maintained concubines without divine censure. God's concern is for the proper ordering of human relations, with each person in their divinely appointed place. These theological contortions reveal the extent to which even the most monstrous practices could be rationalized within the moral framework of the antebellum South. Rebecca's diary entries from the Civil War period reveal the family's growing fear of exposure. "Father says we must be prepared to destroy the records if Union forces approach," she wrote in 1862. "He says they would not understand the scientific nature of our work, that they would see only depravity where we have created order and improvement." As Union forces moved through Louisiana in 1863, the Blackwoods buried the first cache of documents and burned the breeding cabins that had been constructed away from the main slave quarters. By the time federal troops reached St. Landry Parish, the physical evidence of their specialized operation had been concealed. During the war years, the plantation's breeding program continued, but at a reduced scale. Supply chain disruptions and the constant threat of Union incursions forced the Blackwoods to focus more on food production. Rebecca's diary describes the heightened tension. The slaves sense the changing tide. There is a new restlessness among them. Whispered conversations that stop when we approach. Father has increased the patrols and forbidden any gathering of more than 3 people. Last week, 2 of the men from the field quarters attempted to reach Union lines. They were caught and made example of. I could not watch, but the screams carried to the house regardless. This entry reveals both the brutality required to maintain the plantation system and the growing awareness among enslaved people that liberation might be possible. After emancipation, the Blackwood sisters attempted to maintain their plantation with paid labor, but their fortunes declined rapidly. Parish records show that they sold parcels of land throughout the 1870s and 1880s to maintain their household. The plantation house burned under mysterious circumstances in 1889. With local rumors suggesting arson by former enslaved people who had remained in the area. The sisters relocated to New Orleans, where they lived in diminished circumstances until their deaths. Catherine and Mary both died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1905, leaving Rebecca as the sole keeper of their dark legacy. The psychological toll of participation in such a system is evident in Rebecca's later diary entries. "I see their faces in my dreams," she wrote in 1901. "Not just the mothers but the children, my father's eyes looking back at me from faces that should have been strangers. Sometimes I think God has abandoned me to this private hell, where I must remember everything while the world forgets." In her final years, Rebecca appears to have been torn between destroying the remaining evidence and preserving it as testimony. Her decision to bury rather than burn the documents suggests a tortured desire for eventual reckoning. Oral histories collected from descendants of Willow Creek's enslaved community provide glimpses of how knowledge of the breeding program persisted despite official erasure. Eliza Johnson, whose great-great-grandmother was born on the plantation in 1851, recalls family stories passed down through generations. "My grandmother always told us that Willow Creek was a place where blood got mixed and tangled in ways that weren't natural. She said her mother had warned her never to marry anyone whose family had connections to that place, because you couldn't know who might be your own kin. For the longest time I thought it was just superstition. Now I understand what she was really telling us." Archaeological excavations at the former plantation site have uncovered physical evidence supporting the documentary record. The foundations of the nursery quarters match the architectural plans found in the buried papers. Analysis of remains from unmarked graves on the property reveals patterns consistent with Rebecca's descriptions. Women who died young, showing signs of multiple pregnancies, buried without ceremony or marker. Material culture artifacts, dolls made from scraps of cloth, small carved figures, fragments of writing, suggest attempts by the enslaved people to maintain human connection and record their own experiences despite the dehumanizing system. What does this history demand of us now? The Blackwood case represents an extreme example of plantation slavery's fundamental logic. The complete ownership of human beings extended to control over their most intimate biological functions. It demonstrates that slavery was not merely a labor system, but a comprehensive attempt to commodify every aspect of human existence. The careful documentation of the Blackwood operation strips away any possibility of minimizing or romanticizing the antebellum plantation system. It stands as evidence of what human beings are capable of when they classify other humans as property. The response of the academic community to the Blackwood discovery has been divided. Some historians argue that the plantation represents an aberration, a uniquely horrific case that should not be used to characterize the broader institution of slavery. Others maintain that the Blackwood operation simply made explicit what was implicit throughout the slave system: the treatment of human reproductive capacity as an exploitable resource. Dr. Lawrence Mitchell, professor of American history at Tulane University, argues, "What's exceptional about Willow Creek is not what happened there, but the fact that it was so meticulously documented. The Blackwoods wrote down what many others did more informally. Their records force us to confront the centrality of reproductive control to the entire economic structure of American slavery." Local historian Marcus Thibodeau discovered the buried documents during an archaeological survey of the former Blackwood property in 2020. The land, now owned by a timber company, had been scheduled for development into a residential subdivision. "I wasn't looking for anything like this," Thibodeau explained. "We expected to find typical plantation artifacts, building foundations, household items, maybe some agricultural implements. What we uncovered instead was this systematic documentation of atrocity." The discovery has halted development plans as historians and descendants of the enslaved people sold from Willow Creek petition for the site to be preserved as a historical record. Most disturbing are the documents revealing how the Blackwoods maintained control over the enslaved people involved in their breeding program. Beyond physical punishment, they employed psychological manipulation, religious indoctrination, and selective privileges. Rebecca's diary describes how women selected for the program were separated from their existing families and connections, then offered better living conditions, food and clothing, comforts that could be withdrawn at any moment. "Father says isolation makes them more pliable," she wrote. "Without the support of their former communities, they have only us to turn to for protection and favor." This calculated destruction of social bonds represents another layer of violence beyond the physical exploitation. DNA testing has revealed another disturbing aspect of the Blackwood legacy. Genetic markers indicate that Jeremiah Blackwood himself was likely of mixed racial ancestry, possibly with a black grandmother or great-grandmother. This hidden aspect of his identity adds another layer of psychological complexity to his creation of a rigid breeding hierarchy on his plantation. It's possible he was engaging in a perverse attempt to control and categorize aspects of his own identity that he had been forced to deny, suggests Dr. Morgan. The extent of his obsession with bloodlines and racial categorization may have been rooted in his own complicated relationship with racial identity in the antebellum South. Resistance to the Blackwood system, though difficult under such controlled conditions, is documented in subtle forms throughout the plantation records. Productivity reports note malingering and deliberate misunderstanding of instructions among some of the enslaved women. Medical records reference self-induced terminations that Dr. Mercer suspected but could not prove. The clearest evidence comes from an 1853 incident described in both the Plantation Punishment Ledger and Rebecca's diary, an attempted escape by 5 women from the breeding quarters, led by a woman named Sarah. The official record states only that the escape failed and appropriate discipline was administered. Rebecca's private account reveals more. Sarah knew what awaited her and chose death instead. The others received the lash, but Sarah threw herself into the bayou. Father says she was merely property destroyed, but I cannot escape the knowledge that she chose to die rather than remain in the life we had created for her. The Blackwood records force us to confront the full horror of human bondage, not as an abstraction, but as a carefully documented system of bodily exploitation that reached into the most intimate aspects of human life. They demonstrate the extremes of commodification possible when society legally defines human beings as property. Most importantly, they reveal the elaborate mechanisms of historical erasure that have allowed Americans to distance themselves from slavery's darkest aspects. The buried ledgers of Willow Creek Plantation show that what we have forgotten was deliberately hidden, and what was hidden still shapes our world. In the wake of the Blackwood discovery, several Louisiana plantation museums have revised their presentations to more explicitly address the reproductive exploitation of enslaved women. We can no longer tell a story about plantation life that doesn't center this aspect of enslavement, explains Dr. Josephine Wilkins, curator at the River Road Plantation Museum. The evidence is too clear, the implications too profound to continue sidelining these experiences in our historical narratives. The revision represents a significant shift in how plantation tourism, a major industry in Louisiana, presents the antebellum past to visitors. The educational impact extends beyond museums to academic curricula. University history departments across the country are incorporating the Blackwood case study into courses on American slavery, using it to illustrate the intersection of race, gender, and economic exploitation under the plantation system. Dr. Keisha Williams, who teaches at Howard University, has developed a specialized seminar examining the documents. These records provide an unprecedented window into the dehumanizing logic of slavery, she explains. They allow us to teach this history not just as a series of policies and economic arrangements, but as a lived experience that affected real human beings in the most intimate ways possible. For my students, especially those who may be descendants of enslaved people, this is not distant history but family history. Public reaction to the Blackwood revelations has been polarized. Some community members in St. Landry Parish have opposed efforts to memorialize the site, arguing that focusing on such extreme examples sensationalizes history and casts unfair aspersions on their ancestors. Others, including many descendants of the enslaved population, advocate for full disclosure and commemoration. This is not about blame or shame, says Michael Johnson, a community organizer working with the descendant community. It's about truth. We cannot heal what we will not acknowledge. The Blackwood Plantation is part of American history, not just Black history or Louisiana history. Its legacy belongs to all of us, however uncomfortable that might be. The controversy has extended to state legislative chambers, where debates about how to handle the Blackwood site reflect broader tensions over historical memory in the American South. A bill proposing state funding for preservation and educational development of the site narrowly passed the Louisiana House but faces opposition in the Senate. Representative Thomas Guidry, who sponsored the legislation, argues, "We fund battlefield preservation. We fund plantation house restoration. We fund museums celebrating agricultural history. If we're serious about understanding our complete history, we must also preserve sites that tell the darkest chapters of that story." Opponents counter that public funds should not be used for what they characterize as divisive historical projects, preferring that such sites be handled through private initiatives if at all. The most haunting documents from the Blackwood collection are not the clinical ledgers, but the personal items. A small book where Rebecca recorded the names of children born on the plantation, including notations about physical features that matched those of family members, locks of hair tied with ribbon, small hand and footprints pressed into paper. These items suggest moments of human connection occurring within a system designed to deny such connection. They raise unanswerable questions about how people reconcile intimate knowledge of those they simultaneously exploit, how perpetrators maintain their sense of self while engaging in profound dehumanization of others. Historians continue to debate whether the Blackwood plantation represents an outlier or merely an unusually well-documented example of practices that were more widespread. What is certain is that the plantation's profitability was noted and envied by neighboring planters. Letters found among the buried documents include inquiries from other plantation owners about Blackwood's livestock management methods and his approach to increasing natural increase among the servant population. These euphemisms suggest awareness of his methods among a wider circle of planters, even if few may have adopted his most extreme practices. The legal implications of the Blackwood discovery remain complex. While the statutes of limitations have long expired for any crimes committed, questions of inheritance, property rights, and restitution have emerged. Descendants of the enslaved people from Willow Creek have filed legal briefs arguing that the timber company's ownership of the land should be reconsidered in light of the historical evidence. This property was built on and sustained through criminal exploitation, argues attorney James Williams, who represents several descendant families. The profits generated through generations of abuse were used to purchase additional lands that now form part of the timber company's holdings. There needs to be a legal reckoning with this history. Research into parish records has uncovered evidence that Jeremiah Blackwood was not only aware of his own mixed ancestry but actively concealed it. A document from the Virginia county of his birth shows that his maternal grandmother was recorded as mulatto in an early census, though later records list the family as white. This discovery suggests that Blackwood's obsession with controlling and categorizing racial identity through his breeding program may have been rooted in his own experience of racial passing. He created a system that simultaneously denied and exploited the very racial mixture he embodied, suggests Dr. Morgan. It's a disturbing example of how internalized racial ideology can manifest in those with complicated identities. The story of Willow Creek Plantation reminds us that history is not merely what happened, but what we choose to remember about what happened. For over a century, the deliberate breeding of enslaved people was treated as historical footnote rather than central practice, mentioned briefly, if at all, in discussions of American slavery. The Blackwood documents make such marginalization impossible. They demand acknowledgement that reproductive control and exploitation were not incidental to slavery, but fundamental to its operation and profitability in the 19th century United States. You might wonder how such documentation survived when so many sought to destroy it. The answer lies in Rebecca Blackwood's conflicted conscience. Her diary reveals a woman simultaneously participating in atrocity while documenting it for future judgment. "Perhaps one day," she wrote in her final entry, "when all of us are dust, someone will uncover these papers and know the full truth of what happened here. And perhaps in that knowing there might be some form of justice that I was too weak to seek in my lifetime." Her burial of the documents, not in the family cemetery but beneath the chapel where enslaved people had been forced to worship, suggests an act of penance, incomplete but significant. The living descendants of those sold from Willow Creek Plantation have formed a community organization to determine the future of the site and its artifacts. "This is our history, however painful," says Elaine Johnson, whose great-great-grandmother was born on the plantation in 1851. "We get to decide how it's preserved and presented. For too long, others have controlled the narrative about what happened to our ancestors." The group is working with historians, archaeologists, and museum professionals to create a memorial and research center at the former plantation site, ensuring that this history will never again be buried or forgotten. Archaeologists have discovered another dimension of the Willow Creek story, evidence of resistance and cultural persistence among the enslaved population. Excavations near the former slave quarters have uncovered hidden caches of items that Dr. Tanya Richardson, lead archaeologist, identifies as of West African spiritual significance. Cowrie shells, blue glass beads, iron implements arranged in particular patterns. These findings suggest that despite the extreme control exerted over their bodies, the enslaved people maintained spiritual practices and community connections, explains Dr. Richardson. They created hidden spaces of resistance where they could assert their humanity and cultural identity outside the Blackwood system. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Blackwood operation was the elaborate system of surveillance it required. Estate records detail the construction of elevated walkways connecting the main house to the overseer's quarters and the nursery compound, allowing for constant observation. Blackwood's personal journal describes his installation of speaking tubes and early intercom system throughout the buildings to monitor conversations. Rebecca's diary mentions father's informants among the enslaved population, individuals rewarded for reporting on their fellows. This comprehensive monitoring represents another level of violation, the denial of privacy and autonomy, even in the most intimate contexts. What happened at Willow Creek Plantation represents the darkest possibilities of human bondage, the complete control of one human being by another, extended across generations and justified through elaborate systems of racial categorization. It demonstrates that slavery was not merely about labor extraction, but about the comprehensive ownership of human bodies and their reproductive capacity. Most disturbingly, it reveals how such systems corrupt not only those with direct power, but all who benefit from or fail to challenge such power. The complicity of the community, the medical establishment, and religious institutions in maintaining silence about the Blackwood operation implicates the broader society that allowed slavery to exist. The Blackwood case raises profound questions about historical memory and responsibility. How do we reckon with atrocities that were legally sanctioned in their time? What obligations do present-day communities have to acknowledge and address historical wrongs? What does justice look like when both perpetrators and immediate victims are long dead, but the effects continue to ripple through living communities? These questions have no easy answers, but the recovery of the Blackwood documents makes it impossible to avoid them. They demand engagement, not just from historians, but from all who seek to understand American identity and its complex foundations. Recent genetic genealogy has identified a surprising pattern among Blackwood descendants. DNA testing reveals that many individuals who believe themselves to be solely of European ancestry carry genetic markers consistent with descent from the plantation's breeding program. We're finding Blackwood descendants throughout Louisiana and neighboring states who had no idea of their mixed ancestry, explains Dr. Morgan. Generations of passing and deliberate forgetting have created families where important parts of their history were erased. When we contact these individuals with our findings, reactions range from shock and denial to a profound sense of connection to a history they never knew was theirs. You now know about Willow Creek Plantation. You have become part of the chain of witness that Rebecca Blackwood both feared and hoped for when she buried those documents instead of burning them. The question becomes, what will you do with this knowledge? How does understanding this history change your perception of the present? The genetic descendants of Jeremiah Blackwood and those he enslaved walk the same streets today, their blood mingled by force rather than choice, their shared history simultaneously evident in their DNA and erased from their family stories. This is the America that slavery built, a nation of intimate connections denied, of family trees with deliberate gaps, of histories buried but not gone. The final photograph in the Blackwood collection shows the three sisters in their later years, seated on the porch of their New Orleans home around 1900. Their faces are lined with age, their expressions unreadable. Behind them stands a young woman identified in Rebecca's handwriting simply as Martha from the plantation. The woman's features bear a striking resemblance to the Blackwood sisters themselves, raising questions about her identity and relationship to the family. Was she one of the children born of their breeding program, brought with them to New Orleans? Did she know her own origins? The photograph, like so much of this history, offers evidence without resolution, a fragment of a story whose full human dimensions we can never fully recover. As night falls over the former grounds of Willow Creek Plantation, the archaeological team secures the site where the Blackwood documents were found. Additional ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified what appear to be multiple unmarked burial sites throughout the property, the final resting places of those who lived, suffered, and died under the Blackwood regime. Tomorrow, the careful work of recovery will continue, bringing to light what was deliberately hidden. This process of excavation serves as metaphor for the larger historical reckoning taking place, the painstaking unearthing of truth from beneath layers of silence, denial, and deliberate erasure. Some will turn away from what is revealed, finding it too painful to acknowledge.